Welcome to Somebody Asked Me with Janice Case, the podcast where we take questions I've been asked in the past from so many different roles, along with questions you'll ask and we'll ask together to, learn. Along the way, we'll build our capacity to become a community of problem solvers. I'm your host, Janice Case. Let's get to it, shall we? Welcome everybody to episode 21 of Somebody Asked Me with Janice Case. We are very simply picking up on part 2 of a conversation that we started just last week with a group of history teachers and educators who are spending some time with us talking about thinking in terms of history in schools, what we teach, what we don't teach, the implications of both of those things, and how we then understand our current culture and climate as a result of our experience as both history learners in school, and in the case of our panel today, history teachers and educators. So we're joined again by Christina and Jessica and Jennifer and Mark, and we are going to pick up the conversation after having left off last week for part 2, and we are looking forward to hearing what they have to say about the learner themselves and some other really important things for us to think about in terms of as we consider the history of this country, and specifically how that history is portrayed through the teaching of history and our systems of education around the country. So without further ado, back to our panel for part 2, episode 21 of Somebody Asked Me with Janice Case. Let's get to it.
So talk a little bit then, I want to hear somebody talk a little bit about the learner themselves. We've talked about focusing on, we want to create experiences where they can be inquisitive, right? We want to create experiences where they can be curious. We want to create experiences where they can take a bunch of sources and then come to their conclusions about the implications of what they're learning. Talk a little bit about, and Jennifer, I'm going to go to you because you talked about this in our planning session, the social emotional responsibility we have when we're teaching history with kids.
I will mention it here as well. I have a son who is biracial, so I have an extra special understanding to having a child in a county where it is definitely the minority and in a classroom where he's been the only child of color. So I know how he feels at times, as well as working with kids in other aspects, that you have to have that piece of empathy. And when you start that conversation of talking about things that is derogatory or negative to that group of people, you've got to understand there is somebody in the room who is going to turn around, and that one child or two children are going to take that personal, and they're really going to take it to heart that may be the first time they've heard some of that they now are going to be, I don't want to, for lack of a better word, crushed a little bit. It's going to be harmful to their emotional and their feeling as if people are watching them. And middle school is already hard enough, I can tell you, at least for my classroom, that anything else that adds another layer of kind of covering up themselves and they won't feel comfortable in that room. You really need to be understanding to what you're saying and how you're saying it, and be ready to address any other comment negatively as quick as possible, because it really is detrimental to that child at any age, at any venture. And some students, you may not know their background.
Right.
For example, my cousin, my nephew, who's got AJ, my son, as a cousin, has a black member in his family. So for him, he might take it a little, take it very heartedly, and become upset from those things and not realizing certain emotional things that he may have gone through. So it's just those things you have to be very aware of the children of, especially African Americans in the room, because they're going to hear the negative pieces. And I mean, we have so much negative history, but it's okay, but it's got to be taught in a very sensitive and understanding and open way.
Anybody want to add to that?
Well, I think too, we need to remember access. How has access in the internet been a game changer? Because a lot of people have felt lied to, right? They feel like we were taught history from one book, and now it's like, oh, wait a minute, but that's not the truth. This is what happened. And it's been very controversial, and it really elicits a lot of emotions in people, good, bad, and ugly. And so I really think the skill that we need to also help our students understand is, although I may not believe that, I respect, your opinion, and build that empathy that we're seeing that we're lacking in society. We see it all day, every day on social media. And our kids are exposed to that all day, every day. So is remembering that it's a life skill. It's not just, it's also social emotional, but it's also a life skill to be able to conduct ourselves in society today. And so I always say, to the teachers, it's not just an academic responsibility, it's a social emotional, it's a behavioral, and it's a civic responsibility that we have to teach kids, how can I argue or debate in a respectful manner? How can I learn something even though I may not agree with that concept, or I wasn't brought up, or I didn't experience that? And I think we've that's another neglect that we've done in education. I don't point fingers at anybody, it's just been our system. We've evolved so fast with this internet game changer that we're trying to now respond to this and trying to get ahead of it, but it's coming at us so fast that it scares people, it causes frustration, people think that's not true. And then too, when you get into, history teachers, at the high school levels especially, they're content experts. And so it's really pulling themselves out of that content expert and saying, let kids become that expertise, and own that rather than just controlling what you believe happened in history.
Right. Yeah, that's a really important point. That idea of how teachers analyze themselves, right? And I've heard each of you, both in the planning session and then today, do a little bit of that self-analysis. But I wonder about the space we create for teachers to do that, right? Especially when I think in terms of teaching history, but certainly teaching in general, right? Understanding, and we've been talking a lot about this lately, the biases that we come to the table with and how that influences how we go about the act of teaching, if you will. And Jennifer, I'll go back to your piece on the social emotional piece. And my experience on that front, which informed me as a white woman, was being a middle school principal and having a group of African American parents come to me when their sons were coming into 6th grade, and they wanted to partner with the school to put some things in place to ensure that their sons didn't fall prey to what they, as their parents, saw a pattern among African American boys where they get to a certain age and it's not cool to be smart anymore. And so they completely derail from being on an academic path to being on a very different path. And so we did that, and that's for a different episode. But the story one parent told me about why this was going to become important in the beginning was of her own son, who, as a 4th grader, learned about slavery for the first time. And she talked about how sitting in that classroom as one of 1 or 2 Black students in that classroom and learning this history and looking around the room and suddenly seeing himself as different in a way that he had never seen himself different before. And it made me, I didn't know, right? I just didn't know. And so that was a really powerful learning moment for me as an educator, as a mom, as a white woman. But digging into that, there's that piece that you talked about, Jennifer, the social emotional learning. And I think that's a powerful example of how we've missed understanding how impactful history is on kids, depending on their background. In that case, it was an African-American student, right? I could see something similar happening with a student when we're learning about immigration who has parents who immigrated for the first time, and they don't hear a lot of positive things about immigration in this country, especially right now. But and I thought to myself, gosh, we send home like a gazillion heads up to parents that family life education is coming, like on this day at this time, we're going to break the news about, sex to your kid, heads up if you want to do it first. And yet no warning, right, for these parents about this thing that would have such a significant impact. And because nobody knew, and I don't even know if nobody knew is the right way to say it, but it wasn't even on their radar that they should be thinking about it in terms of social emotional well-being of kids, right? And I think that's a whole important piece as we move forward and we think about, well, what can be different, right? And a couple of you talked about that social emotional piece. So yeah, I think we have to dig into that, and I think we have to revisit, right? We're going to be revisiting anyway what and how we teach history, and a part of that has to be then where are the pieces where we have to get kids ready for it, and not just kind of come at it without warning,
And not at a young age. Be careful of the age that you start to put this information in there, from the standpoint of it too early is even worse, because then they've never had a chance to truly become their own person, and this is what is in the back of their mind. So it's just one of those things, you have to think about that. And the first time that you talk about African Americans or Black history, there's more to than just slavery. There's so much more out there that they need to see themselves doing positive things. It does not need to be always negative and it can't just be, not saying Martin Luther King and these people are important. They're very important, but there's so many more than just Harriet Tubman freeing slaves. There's so many people who were free people who can do things. It really does need to be a bigger picture. We need to everything shouldn't revolve around slavery.
Yeah. And I can't remember who said it, but we were talking about in the planning session time frames, right? And teaching kind of periods of time and then letting kids dig out, but evaluating how we're teaching those periods of time and who we're focusing on and why we're focusing on them, right? Of the people we focus on, why do we focus on them and who are we missing? That could give that broader kind of picture, if you will, of contributions and, things that were done that weren't good and all of the things. Jessica, what do you think?
So in Virginia, and as most states, we have state standards. And a few years ago, Virginia got rid of the 7th grade history SOL. So they're starting to loosen up on those standards. But for years, we've been teaching, there's some people in our standards that we're required to teach, or some facts that we're required to teach that we've sat and thought, why is this in here? Why is this important? I think Mark had brought up in our last meeting, the kids have to know about Washington and Lee University. And why? Why do they have to know that? So I think thankfully we can kind of get away from that now that we don't have those SOL tests. But yeah, why are we focusing on some parts of history and not others, and allowing kids to have more choice in what they're learning, I think is really important. But then also making sure that, yes, we're giving them choice, but we're scaffolding and steering them in the direction so that they're having a broad range of choices and not such a narrow path.
Sure, makes sense. Christine, I'm sorry, were you going to jump in?
Yeah, I was just going to mention just two things. I think too, it's important that we ask our kids, what do you think, about what you're seeing? Getting to understand where they're coming from rather than make the assumption. When I have an 11-year-old daughter and we're watching, the protest and, what do you think about this? And she's like, I don't understand why we're fighting. So just that the answer told me she doesn't understand the history of our country, why we're so divided. Then kids are, older kids are hearing like the term systematic racism, white privilege, and a lot of them don't understand the historical context behind that, and yet we jump in and start pointing fingers and telling them what they should and shouldn't learn. The other piece I was going to mention that, you talked about testing, is I think sometimes there's this misconception that we have to teach these standards because we're going to be tested on this. And really, we have moved away from that concept, and it's more about becoming the analytical thinker. Can I read a historical document? Can I analyze that historical document? Can I write an argument off of this historical document? And can I create a counter argument to this historical document? So, I have to always remind my teachers that yes, these pieces that you find interesting and important, what's the purpose of that? And really kind of helping kids develop that skill. And again, it's not just an academic, but it's that social, ability to be able to have a respectful debate with someone and not go on the attack, because what they're seeing is attack, and it's not really accomplishing what we need to. So I just wanted to, point that out, that students are tested on the historical skills, but it's in a very different context now. Going from state tests to PSATs to even the GRE. You're required to read something. So I have to remind my teachers, kids aren't going to do better on that because you taught them the Constitution.
Right.
They're going to do better that you provided them multiple chances to read a historical document and analyze that. And it's like, okay, got to remind myself that. But you're right, Janice, that isn't the way we've taught.
Yeah. It's not, there's going to be a shift, right? And in just a minute, I'm going to ask, especially the teachers in the group, to talk about, so what do you feel like as a teacher now, right? What's the kind of guidance and support you need in order to make some of the shifts we're talking about? Before I do, I'll point this out, and that is that, on some level, we are talking about giving teachers more flexibility, and I don't disagree with that. And we're talking about giving kids more choice, and I don't disagree with that. But we have to be careful, because we know sometimes with both of those things, and I'm going to emphasize the teacher piece here, you all know them, right? Then you have the teacher who spends 4 months on the Vietnam War because that's their sweet spot, and they, brush aside some other things. So the balance, right? How we find the balance of, no, these are the things that we have to, that kids have to have exposure to, right? That they have to be introduced to. If we're gonna educate a populace who has some equitable footing when they get out of K-12 education. And by that, I mean that they can look at what's going on around them and go, oh, yeah, that makes sense, because, all of these things that I've learned along the way, right? And that they can look at each other and be able to have that educated, respectful debate, because they all kind of understand those concepts similarly because they've had those experiences. So I'm not pretending to have the solution, by the way, but there's a balance to be struck there, because we don't want teachers who feel like, they have all these facts and timelines, and so therefore they have to teach all these things. And I'm hearing you all say we're shifting away from that anyway, focusing more on analyzing history, et cetera. But we also can't say, here's X number of periods of time, teach whatever you want, because we're naturally going to go toward the things that we feel safest with. And honestly, some of the things that are missing that we've been talking about are the things that make people uncomfortable, and people are going to steer away from unless they begin given an awful lot of support to prep them to be ready to do it. All right, Jennifer, what are you thinking?
I will tell you, our system has done a big shift with preparing us to have those awkward conversations and to look at ourselves. There was a training last year. We went through an equity training. I think it was 3 hours or a half a day or something like that. And it was really to have some really awkward conversations. I would almost say it makes you feel as awkward as crossing the line activity.
Okay.
Remember that. So it's those things to make you really look at yourself to decide. And I think they use that activity to an extent to show you, to kind of visualize that. And so we are doing better. But it definitely gets a lot of people out of their comfort zone. I wish I could say it was a magic wand and I could say they're all going to be okay, but I think it's going to be hard for some teachers to break some of their habits, not wanting to be that way, but just because I've always taught it, it's okay. I got 5 years to retirement. I got to just keep going through this. So the change is really hard. So I'm hoping we get enough younger teachers in there, and I can finally say younger than me, and come in and really help rejuvenate it, because this generation coming through is just a lot more open-minded.
Yeah.
And I don't want to say the term that people say, I don't see color, because that's not true. We all see
Right.
that color as it's maybe a determination. It's not it's a discrimination, not discrimination. It's a identifier, but it doesn't mean that it is what you are. So I think we just have to really work at it and to try to truly be self-aware first, and then hopefully you can take little baby steps. But it definitely starts with your school system pushing it down from the top.
Yeah.
And I can say and I believe Mark and Jessica will back me up on this, they've done a really good job. They've created new positions. They really have put this at the forefront of our school system. So I can at least say kudos for us.
Mark, you were going to jump in.
Yeah, just kind of jumping off what Jennifer was saying, like I've been impressed with some of the equity trainings that we've had to sit through, because they are hard. And I mean, you look at Loudoun County, we have a lot of white teachers in Loudoun County. They're like, listening to your podcast last week, hearing, it was a principal from Parkview talk, and he pointed that out and his attempt. And it's nice and refreshing to see that. And I'm speaking as a white teacher who's, I think the hardest part to kind of do, to go off what Jennifer again was saying, is you have to give teachers, like, okay, it's difficult, but you got to help them feel as comfortable as you can so that they can be comfortable with their students. And you can't just go in like firing right off the bat with some of this stuff. You have to make those students and you have to make your colleagues comfortable. And I think some of it you have to tie in, and like, I can't speak because I don't have children, but you have to tie in the parents. You can't do,
Absolutely.
you don't know what's going on at home. Like, I mean, like some of my students, when they hear the KKK still exists, their jaws drop. And that's that's scary, but that's the reality. And that's why we're having these conversations.
Jessica?
So yeah, our county is doing a really good job trying to put a big focus on equity and training the staff on that topic. And then in history specifically, I had mentioned before with SOL tests, we don't have those anymore. And our county has now adopted more of a project-based learning approach. And so we have these performance assessments that they have to do instead of testing. And so that really focuses on the critical thinking piece for our kids and getting them to take a stance on something and support that stance using facts that they've researched. So I think that's a really great direction. So far we have 3 of those. So for 3 units out of the year, we have those. And my team has been trying to build more of those throughout the year. But as far as change for history and the way that it's taught, I think what Christina was talking about with those big concepts, have, instead of the way that we have a framework for our state now, where it's Reconstruction, then westward expansion, then the timeline,
Right.
changing that framework to be concept based.
Right.
Would be really helpful if the state would do that for teachers. I think that would be really beneficial for everybody.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. So, as I think in terms of how to kind of bring our conversation to a close, heads up that I am going to come to each of you for a final word. And the prompt really is going to be that given your role, teacher, and then certainly Christina, supporter of teachers, right, at that district level. What do you want for kids moving forward? Right? If you can think about one thing you want for kids moving forward, what do you want for kids moving forward? So while you're thinking about that, this season of this podcast has been committed to having ongoing conversations about systemic racism in this country, because in our current state of unrest that was prompted certainly by George Floyd's murder and his only being fueled by the events of the last week or two, has caused us in large part to take a really good look at what's wrong with our present, which of course has led us then to taking an even harder look at our past, which is kind of where this conversation comes from. So I just think that part of what I wanted, why I wanted to have this conversation with you all today, is because I kept thinking to myself, imagine how much unity could be accomplished if we took on the task of advocating for creating and implementing an accurate portrayal of our country's history, and ensuring that it's taught in every classroom across the country in a way that protects student social emotional health, and creates the space for them to be inquisitive. And those are the kind of 2 of the big things that I'm taking away from all the things I'm hearing you all say. So imagine that, like, at the very least, that could be a starting point for a more common understanding of where we are, and a more common understanding of where we are is what it's going to take to be someplace different, someplace more positive, someplace where unity is more present. And so with each episode, we want to make sure that we can give the folks listening an action to take. And so the common action I'm going to offer to our listeners, and certainly any of you are welcome to jump in on this with other ideas, is whether you're a parent, a teacher, a school leader, a member of a community, ask, right? I think it's really important for us to collectively ask, what are we teaching right now? Why are we teaching that? And what are our kids going to take away from it that are going to contribute to, and I know this is going to sound really West Coast tree hugging, but a better world, right, for them to exist in. So ask, I think, is really important. And a part of how you can investigate and learn is to all those standards that, everybody on our panel today have talked about are all online, right? They're not mystery. They're not secrets. No matter what your role is, you can go look up 7th grade history standards. You can go look up fourth grade history standards. You can go look up, etc. And use that as a basis for asking questions and probing, not in a way necessarily that's designed to bring conflict as much as it is to bring understanding, and then perhaps change that can contribute, as I said, to our kids' experience. So I'm going to come around, and like I said, if you want to add to the actionable part, please, if you have something that you'd love to see people do. And then, kind of as the last word, I'd love to hear your thoughts about what you want for kids, however you capture that. Jennifer, I'm going to start with you, and then for the sake of making this easy for you guys, I'm going to go to Mark, then Jessica, and then Christina, okay? Go ahead, Jennifer.
My goal as a history teacher is really trying to make sure every student feels safe, nurtured, valued, a sense of pride, educated when they walk out of my room, as well as being inquisitive. I do want them to question everything and ask why. And so to go along with the asking, just inquisitive or inquiry, however you like to pick that term, but I really want them to question things, because I think that will make change, or at least seek for them the truth, whatever the truth may be.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. I appreciate that. Mark, what you thinking?
So I want every one of my students to be heard, to feel like they have a voice, that they come through my room, that I know who they are, I know something about them, I know, like, I see them as a person, not just a student that's sitting there for a school year and then see ya. And I think, like, that's one of the reasons I became a social studies history teacher is, like, we have such an opportunity, and that's partly why I love this subject, because there's so many opportunities to do that in 7th grade and with our curriculum. And I think just what we need to do as educators is be okay with being uncomfortable, spending time learning more about things we've been leaving off. I think it was in the last couple months, Trevor Noah did a piece on, like, how there are textbooks out there in states that I won't name that really undercut like the horrific aspects of slavery and just many other things in our history that, like, it's just appalling as a teacher. And, like, yeah, there's a lot of negative in history, but it's part of my passion, and I don't want that to happen moving forward in my lifetime. I want us to be better. And my last point, and Jess, sorry that you're going to hear me say this again, because I say it a lot throughout the year, and I steal it from Bill and Ted's. It's like, be excellent to each other. I just want, like, I tell the kids, you guys are like, I know everyone gives you guys a lot of grief as a generation, but you're better than my generation. You're better than, because while it's not perfect, you're way more accepting of people of different color, of different sexual identities. And like, that makes me feel like maybe we're doing something a little bit right. And I'm hoping, as I'm an old person, I see the generation I taught doing really great things.
Thank you for that, Mark. Appreciate that. Jessica?
Jennifer and Mark said it very well. I want my students to feel safe. I want them to know that I see them as a person and not, they're a person before they're a student. And they come to class with their own issues and their own background, and we need to be understanding of that. But we brought up the word empathy a lot today, and I think that out of everything, I want my students to be more empathetic. And I hope that going through my class that they see that in me, and then also learn how to build that skill in the future of empathy. So it's definitely something that you need to continue practicing throughout life.
Love that. Thank you, Jessica. All right, Christina, what you thinking?
I'm sorry, my dog just walked in here.
Oh, good.
I just want to say that I think, today as we are living a very, very politically charged country, and we're very divided. And so for our students, I want to, tap into what Jessica said, is we need to be empathetic and build kids to be empathetic, because I think they are really being pulled in different directions, number one, but also two, to realize that they are the solution, that we have to help them discover what are these solutions, what can we learn from the past, how can we prevent the past from repeating itself, because there's that fear that may happen. And so how do we help them feel comfortable talking about controversial topics today in a mature, respectful manner? That's takes a lot. So then my last point to that is, then we have to invest. If that's what we need to invest in our history programs and our history teachers, not just curriculum, but also that instructional shift. How do I handle controversial topics? Jennifer said, you know, the older generation versus the younger generation. How do we help everyone work as a team to accomplish what we really want?
Thank you for that. So, you know, I love the timing of this because school is starting. And, you know, our focus on history is really critical because school is starting. But even setting that aside for just a second, you know, there's the whole pandemic and you all teaching for the first time in a way that you've never really been asked to teach before. And there's so much craziness all over the place about schools and teachers and the whole thing. And what you all just did was throughout the course of this conversation, and especially here at the end, was really prove what most of us know, but a lot of people don't because they don't have direct access to a teacher. And that is that you have the heart and you know, your primary focus is taking care of our kids. And that even though we know some things have to be different, you have the willingness to do it. And so I hope that our listeners, in addition to everything else they take away from the conversation and all that you've shared today, take that away and assume that every teacher they encounter is the same. And we know they're not all, but assume that every teacher that they encounter shows up every day wanting to do the absolute best they can do. Nobody sets out to screw it up. Nobody sets out to say, gosh, I really hope I ruined some kid's life today, right? That it's the heart, and you guys all showed that today. So thank you for sharing that with us. Thank you, by the way, for, you know, giving us a little over an hour of your time in the midst of trying to start doing all the other stuff you're trying to do right now. My timing couldn't have been worse on that front. And don't be surprised if we call on you for future conversations, because I think the more our listeners can hear right from the source, the better off we're all going to be. So thank you guys so much.
Okay, here we go, Melissa. So part 2, right, of this conversation really delivered just like we thought it would. It was really important to me to be reminded of the social emotional component of teaching history, right? So Christina makes an important point early on in that realm because she talks about kids having access to the world, that no longer is their exposure limited to what a state or district or even teacher puts in front of them, right? That when you couple that, what all of those people kind of put in front of them with what they can learn with their access to the world, that's a whole different understanding of what a kid's walking around with, right?
Absolutely. I have to say, the second part of this interview absolutely blew me away. I thought the first part was extremely powerful, but listening to this part,
yeah.
I keep saying it, but it's the truth. It's one of those things that while you know it, you don't actually realize it until you hear it or someone says it. And what you just said is exactly the realization that I had. That it's no longer like when we were growing up, not to date us, but when we were growing up, it's like, you know, what we learned in school was what we learned. Yeah. That was it. Unless you had a parent that was more knowledgeable, who was extremely involved in your education and taught you more. But in a lot of cases, what I walked out of history class with was all that I had, which is why a lot of my learning came as an adult about history. I didn't learn a lot of stuff. I learned the core stuff that Mark mentioned, which were, you know, certain wars, certain time periods, slavery's over, the end. And so actually realizing that now, you know, my own son or my own nieces and nephews and godsons, whatever, they carry a computer in their pockets with their cell phones every day. And being on social media, they're getting exposed to different things every day.
Absolutely.
So they're learning a lot more. And so teachers do have to be aware of the fact that kids are coming in with their own knowledge and opinions and thoughts. And so I don't envy the teachers.
Right?
That's, you know, that's a tough job that doesn't pay very well. So kudos to them for even being willing to dig deep and figure it out and want to make it better.
Well, and you know, you said that so beautifully, and then you take that piece, right, that Christina introduced us to, and then you couple it with Jennifer just slamming us right in the face with the experience of the kid around history and how
Yes.
thoughtful and deliberate teachers have to be about understanding that. And she, very kindly shares her own son, who she identifies as biracial, and his
Yeah.
experience in learning about slavery. And you realize the role that teachers play in a child's understanding of the world around them. And so take everything you just said, Melissa, and couple that now with, oh, by the way, teachers, we need you to be really kind of in tune with
Exactly.
their, social emotional health from the perspective of, if I'm the only black kid in the classroom, or I'm one of 2 or 3 black kids in the classroom, and for the first time ever, you're introducing me to this idea that in the past, white people own people who look like me, right?
And openly mistreated.
Yes.
And beat and whipped
Yep.
and raped. And,
Yep.
Even though we don't cover that to the extent that we
Sure.
should in school,
Sure.
I can tell you, Janice, that my personal experience with that was a lot of shame,
Yeah.
a lot of embarrassment.
Yeah.
And it may be why I am so proud of my history as an adult,
Right.
because it didn't start that way.
Yep.
I did not start off with a lot of knowledge of Black history, and the little bit that I had was not something that left me with feelings of pride,
Sure.
or happiness. And so that is, I wouldn't have, another thing I wouldn't have thought of until I heard it. The idea that, when a kid walks into a class, that's all they have.
Yep.
And then you have some teachers who, like, I've read stories about teachers who, will make the Black kids reenact being slaves and the white kids reenact, like that kind of stuff.
Yep.
Is emotionally heavy,
Yeah.
or damaging either. And so hearing a teacher be aware of that and reminding others to be aware of that,
Yep.
is necessary.
Yeah.
Absolutely necessary.
Yeah, absolutely. And I value that each one of the folks on our panel could really identify their role in that, right? How
Yes.
they're thinking. That's why we put this particular panel together. We literally just did an all call, right, on Facebook. And as I said in the beginning of the interview, the scope was narrow, right? It was all secondary people,
Right.
not by design. It just worked out that way.
Right.
But because their personal experiences, like Jennifer's, they could reach back into elementary world and really think in terms of the learners at that levels and the teachers at those levels as well. So it's a beginning, right? Just like every single conversation we have.
Everything we've done.
Yeah,
That's right.
it's just a beginning, and there's so much more to explore. We can't possibly exhaust it right here, right now. But our hope is that the folks listening are having the epiphanies we're having, right? Which is,
Exactly.
I mean, I feel like I kind of knew it, but until I heard someone say it out loud, I didn't think of it that way. And if you're a listener and you're walking away with that, then mission accomplished for us, right? That's our
Exactly.
that's our sweet spot. And we say this every single time. If you're having those kinds of epiphanies, please like the page, share the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel, all the things, because we really want we keep saying this, but it's the truth. Like, we're just regular people having conversations with regular people about
Right.
really critical topics for all of us to become well-versed and well-educated around. So,
Absolutely. And one of the things we like to do also is to kind of give people an action step,
Yes.
things that they can actually do. And what I'm hoping that this podcast will do, this particular one, this episode, we've talked about how much of history has been left out.
yeah.
So I'm hoping that people will take the time to research
Yep.
history. If you didn't know about the Tulsa Massacre, go look it up. If you don't know about Black Wall Street, go look it up. If you
Yeah.
don't know that Central Park used to be a Black neighborhood, go look it up.
Yep.
The information's out there now. That's the great thing about social media and the internet. It's there if you really want to find it. So do that kind of research, but then also have those conversations about how these things may be impacting your children's classmates,
Yeah.
or your children in general.
That's
Make
it.
your children aware, if you're a white American or a white person in general, make your child aware that discussions about, in history class about slavery may be uncomfortable for their
Absolutely.
classmates who are not white. And so that they know, that there is no, like the episode, digging back Jameson's story,
Yeah.
so there is no
Yeah.
quote unquote joking about stuff like that.
Exactly.
That quote unquote, you know, putting on a KKK hood is not a gag.
Exactly.
Things like that. Those are the actions we hope. At least I know that I hope, Janice, not to speak for you, but I think I can.
Absolutely.
Those are the things that we hope you'll take away from these podcasts. Absolutely, sharing it is the easiest and best thing to do because you'll be reaching others, but doing some of the additional work too, because that's necessary as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I want to add to the actions that you just suggested. And thank you for, you know, making sure that we drive to that part of the conversation. You know, what this, the 2 episodes here, the collective piece here on this little series made me really think about was, you know, I'm going back to our conversation with Melvin a few episodes ago about unity. And I thought, imagine how much unity could be accomplished if we took on the task of advocating for, creating, and implementing an accurate portrayal of our country's history.
That's right.
And
Absolutely.
ensuring that it's taught in every classroom across this country in a way that protects student social emotional health and creates a space for them to be inquisitive. Imagine that at the very least, it could be a starting point for simply understanding, right? Understanding
Absolutely.
each other. So I would add to what you just said as far as actions, you know, if you're a parent, ask, what is being taught and why? If you're a teacher,
Absolutely.
ask, what am I being told to teach and why? If you are a school leader, ask, what are we collectively expecting our teachers to teach and why? And as a community member, same thing. Ask why. If we each are asking why and insisting on an answer to that question, and then insisting on the change that's going to be necessary, if we assume that the answer to that question isn't what it should be, we're taking huge leaps then, right, toward this idea of unity. So I want to shift us very quickly so that our listeners know what's coming up next, Melissa. So next week, we're actually going to shift gears a little bit in our organic planning process. Melissa and I decided that it would be important for us to intersperse in our conversation around racial inequity, around systemic racism, social injustice, that it would be important to intersperse some of the learning that we do together with some of the learning from first season. Remember, season 1, we launched this whole podcast around this idea of considering 8 different realms of life that we all engage with on a daily basis. And we shifted away from that at the start of this season because we wanted to make sure we responded to the urgency around the conversation of systemic racism. And we continue to make that our focus as it needs to be. But we also recognize that the need of the listener might also be to keep building on those 8 realms and to be able to like have some time in between those conversations around race to really absorb them, kind of let them soak in, figure out your space in them, and then come back to it. So with that in mind, next week, we're actually going to air an episode that we recorded quite a while ago, taking us back to the realm of family and marriage, with a conversation about how a marriage is impacted by cancer and how you come through the other side together. And it's kind of by accident, but it worked out real well that it's in time for October, which is Cancer Awareness Month. We're going to be joined by Tessa Richter Guevara, who is a very special woman who's going to help us understand this journey by sharing a kind of an intimate portrayal of her journey with breast cancer and how it impacted her relationship with her husband and how their marriage came through on the other side. So she's going to offer us some insights on that. In the meantime, Melissa and I are going to be working behind the scenes to go back and chunk some of our early episodes this season that are very lengthy to make sure that we can re-air them in smaller chunks and ensure that every single person out there can access them in a way that will help them kind of learn and be moved by them. We recognize that when you have an episode that's an hour and a half, 2 hours long, that in and of itself can be a reason that folks don't listen, and we want to make sure that we acknowledge that and that we reframe the conversations in a way that ensure everybody can access them based on their time and their ability to do so. So that's what's going to be coming up. That's what you can expect from us in the coming weeks. We appreciate, again, liking the page, subscribing to the YouTube channel, sharing it with the world, so that we can, again, as regular people, impact the lives of as many other regular people as possible. So tune in next week. We're going to get back to that realm of marriage and parenting, and we'll look forward to joining you in that conversation then. And so join us and we'll get to it.